Hi, welcome to Contemporary Painting. This is an exciting class that in a way is about the history of painting. And so as an introduction, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the way that artists have painted for centuries and centuries before we actually start to talk about the way that we're going to paint in a more contemporary style. So oil paint was a common paint used throughout history when artists were creating very realistic paintings. This painting technique is done in a glazing technique. And then the other technique I want to talk to you about is a fresco. And so most people think that all of the famous paintings throughout time were painted in the same way and in a way that they weren't. So now I'd like to share my screen and show with you two of the most famous paintings throughout time, the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel. I'll start. They were painted about the same time during the Renaissance time. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. I just want to start with the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is not an oil painting. A Sistine Chapel is what's called a fresco. And a fresco, the word fresco sounds fresh, and I want you to think about it painted on fresh plaster. And so most frescoes were always painted on the walls or ceilings of interiors of buildings. And what the artist did is they put down wet plaster and they used a group of materials of pigments and egg temperas and other natural materials, and they painted wet paint onto the wet plaster so that when the plaster dried and the paint dried, the paint and the wall became one. And it's not like a coating of paint on a plain wall. It like chemically merged together and the wall became the paint and the paint became the wall. And so most interior paintings, especially in Italy and other places around Europe, were all done in the fresco style, in which more like a watercolor style paint was painted on wet plaster. Now, the Mona Lisa and most all realistic paintings of that time were done in what's called a glazing technique. And what makes the Mona Lisa so amazing is that it was painted over 2-year time. And so I want you to imagine that Leonardo da Vinci took oil paint, which is a natural material found from the earth, and ground up pigments that they would find, like actual cobalt and actual cadmium that they would mine, and they would grind it up with linseed oil until it became the consistency of oil paint as we would know it. And then they would take the linseed oil and water it down, so to speak, but like thin it out, thin it out, thin it out until it was a very thin, as they call, glaze. And that glaze was applied onto the canvas in a microscopic thin layer and let dry. And then another layer and another layer and another layer over time, building up this thin, thin, thin layer of glass-like glaze that they applied over a long period. And with that becomes like layers and layers and layers of this thin, opaque material that gives a painting a luminescence that is unmatched with any technique. If you go and see the Mona Lisa, some people are like, oh, it's so small, which it's not really that small. It's like 20 by 30. It has its own room in the Louvre. But what it is it glows from within. If you really look at it carefully, it almost looks like it's backlit, and her face and her skin and everything seems to glow with a luminosity. And the way that that is achieved is through this glazing technique. What made the Mona Lisa so famous? It was always considered a masterpiece. It was always considered extremely realistic looking, with that beautiful landscape in the background, which goes into space. But it wasn't until 1911, when it was stolen from the Louvre and missing for 2 years, that the whole entire world got turned upside down at everybody saying, "Where is the Mona Lisa? Where is the Mona Lisa?" And the fact that she was missing and then eventually found, they actually even took Picasso into questioning in the police station to think that maybe he stole the painting. But they ended up finding it. It was stolen by a former employee of the Louvre, and it was returned without any damage. But in order for you to understand the class that we're taking now and the painting styles we're going to start now, I want you to understand three major concepts. One is that for centuries, people were either painting frescoes or they were painting oil painting in this glazing technique, glazing over long periods of time to create this luminosity. And the other thing is that artists almost exclusively worked in studios. They did not go outside with their paints until the invention of the tube of paint, which came in the 1800s. So for hundreds of years, artists would draw in studios, draw on location, draw in life, and then go back into a studio and paint in a studio space or in the actual location where the painting was, on the wall of a church or a ceiling, or as in the Mona Lisa, on a canvas board, a piece of wood. But they weren't painting outside. The paint wasn't mobile. It was hard to get this glazing technique, and they weren't really doing that. And so it wasn't until the 1800s when they actually invented these portable tubes of paint that you could like bring places. Then all of a sudden, wham, artists did no longer needed to stay in a studio. They could now go out and paint on location, and they can also paint in a different technique other than this glazing. And that's when we're going to talk about broken color and the thick paint of the Impressionists. And then finally, around late 1800s, at the same time as the invention of the tube of paint, was the invention of the camera. And the camera changed everything, because the purpose of the artist was to depict life, depict scenes, depict events. Can you imagine the only way to ever see what you look like is if an artist drew you or painted you? Can you imagine never having a photograph of yourself or to know what you looked like when you were younger? That is a reality of most people that grew up before the 1800s. There was no way that they would have any pictorial representation of their life or of other people's lives unless an artist drew it or painted it or sculpted it. And so now the whole world has opened up to this machine that can now take pictures and depict life exactly the way that it is. And so between the invention of the tube of paint and the invention of the camera, artists no longer had to stay in the studio and paint in that type of location, and B, they didn't have to depict real life anymore. And that's where this course starts. This course starts after the glazing technique, after frescoes, after artists have been depicting real life realistically for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now it starts in a contemporary style and contemporary brushstrokes in more modern style. So I hope you enjoy this class. I hope you kind of understand where we're beginning in the series of paintings. And I hope you enjoy some of the messy experiences we're going to have. So get out your paints and let's get ready to make some art.